So let me now introduce you to Dr. Derek Yak. Derek is the president of the Foundation for a Smoke-Free World. He spent 30 years with that grit and resilience of being an anti-smoking advocate. While he was at the World Health Organization, he was at the cabinet director level and one of the architects of the Framework for Convention on Tobacco Control, FCTC. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you Dr. Derek Yak. Derek.
Thanks, Chris, and to all of you watching and taking note. It's really a huge pleasure and privilege to give you a snapshot of the results of a lot of work done by a lot of people, and to them we have a huge thanks working around the world, both our current team as well as many of you out in the field. Let me go straight to it. First of all, let me just give an indication of who carried out the study and a disclaimer that the Foundation commissioned Cantor polling to do the survey. And please note that the foundation is an independent foundation funded by a grant from Philip Morris International. Many people might say, why do we focus on the smoker? It seems so obvious that there's a need to address both the deep needs and concerns of smokers. And I think the best way of understanding it is to reflect on where we're standing here outside Washington on some of those great words about our inalienable rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. To understand those and the implication to smoking, we need to understand the deep driving forces of smokers. And we'll see that each one of those words has implications for how we go about understanding the smoker and how we go about thinking about the appropriate way to reduce their risks and bring down the predicted 1 billion deaths we expect this century. The purpose of the survey, therefore, was really threefold: to understand smokers' experiences and challenges, to probe awareness of smoking and health impacts, going a little bit beyond other surveys, and most importantly, to assess the perceptions of risk and the influence on choices. A few words on the methods, and a lot of this is available on our website, and I would urge people dig into it. 17,000 participants were interviewed in 13 countries in 7 languages, representative of the adult population over the age of 18. We also had complementary qualitative surveys to dig much more deeply into how people feel, their emotional issues, their deeper understanding of the importance of smoking in their lives, the importance of vaping, some of their desires to quit, and so on. Just a bit of context, and we have here 2 sets of data on the percentage of adult smokers in the world from our survey and from WHO. Generally, the figures are reasonably in the same ballpark. There are different survey strategies. The one is a younger group from WHO. Ours is 18 plus. The bottom line for you to focus is how much of this is in red, which means that smoking rates by age and sex are above 25%. Some of them going up in excess of 50%. While we've seen some reductions around the world, the fact that we've still got 1 billion smokers is obviously of grave concern. A couple of real numbers in the US, around 36, 37 million smokers. The same in Russia, about 36 million smokers. In contrast, in India, about 250 million people use a wide variety of tobacco products. 250 million. And of course, in all of the other countries, we have smoking rates that are still very high. Some very established markets where tobacco control has been practiced for decades, like France, we have smoking rates of well over 1/3 in men and women, and in Greece, much the same. So I put this up to make the point, the job is not done. We have a huge job ahead of us if we really want to bring down the death and disease rates within a generation, which is the goal of the foundation. So what are some of the findings? At the macro level on the first one, smoking is deeply integrated into most smokers' daily lives. So quitting means more than just giving up cigarettes. Chris highlighted the importance of habits and habit formation and how we often act in our worst, best long-term interest by continuing activities today that will harm us in future, even though we intuitively know that that's going to happen. We know that there are a set of factors, physical, behavioral, and emotional, that drive the decisions of smokers to either continue or for them to seek what they find pleasurable or rewarding in their products. Very importantly, and I think superimposed on this, is that while it's not only a physical addiction and is deeply ingrained in the behavioral, emotional, and social aspect of people's lives, that physical dependence is something that we have to take account of and can address through improvements in the technology, both for cessation and for reduced risk. So failing to understand the physiological response actually negates the potential benefits of other interventions, which tend to be very weak by themselves. For example, more education, more awareness, bigger warnings will actually not make it in the face of a very strong physiological drive and in the face of very strong social, interactive, and behavioral realities. Unfortunately, the technology we're using, believe it or not, is so advanced that a laser pointer will not show up on it. And I try to get a very long stick, but I'll be dashing across here. So I'm going to ask you to focus a little bit on some of these graphics as I go through it. But I'll highlight a couple of quick points. Smoking is intimately part of smokers' daily rituals and routines. If you look at the brown bar, you'll see that is coffee consumption. And you'll see that in Greece, in Lebanon, about the middle, and in Brazil, the strong association between a cup of coffee and a smoke is very well known. Interestingly, that differs in terms of the US or France, where food and alcohol come into play as being a very strong association. And across all of the countries in the gray, you will see what appears to be a habit, reaching for your first cigarette first thing in the morning, is a combination of a habit, but also a physiological drive to get your brain nicotine level back to where you're able to function and feel some of the rewards. Both are happening, and that is very common across the world. Unsurprisingly, we find that smokers have close friends who smoke, and this is ubiquitous. In every part of the world, this applied more to smokers, and you can see the relevant figures for ex-smokers in blue and in dark blue for non-smokers. Why is this important? This is important because an intervention focused just on individual without taking account of who they interact with, their friends, their efforts to try and break loneliness, who they socialize with, is doomed to failure even after taking account of the physiological issues. And that's borne out as well by the proportion of smokers who have a partner or spouse who smoke, again, very high across the world. One of the questions people always were surprised, why are you even bothering to ask the question about global awareness of smoking and health impacts? Surely it's self-evident, everybody knows the facts. Well, when we ask the question in general terms, most smokers around the world do answer that they know that smoking is harmful for their health. The first point I would say is that if you look at these graphics, the highest figure is 95, 96%. In some of the countries where the smoking rates are highest. So they know, but they're unable to act on that knowledge. Second point is, notice the figures are not 100%. So almost 20% of people in South Africa, in the UK, do not actually understand the harms. And in India, only 2/3 understand the harms. When we probe in the data deeper into when people think about the harms of smoking, what exactly do they think about? Cancer usually comes up there, way up high on the list. Quite a bit behind is heart disease. A little bit behind that is lung disease and tuberculosis, particularly important in countries like India and South Africa, comes very low on the list, suggesting that, yes, they have the knowledge, but they actually don't have the full knowledge. When we ask people about addiction, and addiction is a very vague term in terms of lay understanding, it doesn't have the precision of dependence, which is a physiological response understood by professionals. But the lay sense is, I'm addicted, which means I have to have it every day, or I've got to have it on a common basis, on a regular basis. Again, people consider themselves addicted in fairly high numbers. The interesting questions start coming out when we ask smokers, how do you consider your health? And the percentage of smokers reporting to be in excellent health is generally below that of non-smokers who report a higher percentage being in good health. Intuitively, you'd expect that to be the case because presumably smoking would be causing a lot of the ill health problems, and therefore they would report not being in good health. So then why do we find the next finding? That despite the fact that they are reporting a lower proportion of being in excellent health, they are reporting a lower seeking of healthcare support. So they're going to the doctors and the healthcare providers at lower rates, even though presumably they must have a bigger reason to actually go. And I think that again plays back to some of the points Chris is saying, that there's either a misunderstanding about or denial of their own health risk. There may be on the health professional side stigmatization against smokers. And I've found in my own work previously in South Africa that the smoking rates among doctors who smoke was twice as high for their patients than doctors who didn't smoke. And when you look at what proportion of the doctors or nurses or dentists are providing advice, simple advice, it tends to be extremely low across any of the adult major risks, suggesting an opportunity we'll come back to later. The third category, which is becoming really important now as we're starting to understand that you can materially lower the risk, you can continue with the nicotine product and lower your risk of cancer, heart disease, lung disease by either having a medicated product like a nicotine replacement therapy or an e-cigarette or a heat-not-burn or a snus product, recognizing that it's the combustion that really does most of the killing, the burning. You roll something up, light it and stick it in your mouth. The stuff that's burning and kind of makes sense is the stuff that really kills you, not the nicotine. And we're going to come back to that just now because it's a fundamental point that was understood by the tobacco industry in the 60s, written about by academics like Mike Russell in the 70s, when he made the point that smokers smoke because of the nicotine, but they die because of the tar and the smoke. That simple fact from 40 years ago is still not fully understood, yet has profound implications for how we lower risk over time. So let's look at perceptions of risk, nicotine as a substance. And what you'll find across the world in blue, you have nicotine. Nicotine comes out, moderate use of nicotine comes out in just about every country as more dangerous than moderate use of alcohol. And if you look to the parts of the world where alcohol is high, you'd find that it's pretty close as well. This, I would argue, is a serious misperception, overstating the impact of nicotine. When we look a little bit deeper in terms of, do you believe that nicotine causes cancer or heart disease? Again, the results are really troubling because they suggest that over 50% of people in just about every country believe nicotine causes cancer. Yet there is no major body of scientific evidence to suggest that that is the case. None. With regard to heart disease, you can see the figures are pretty high as well. So again, if you believe that something's going to cause cancer, you obviously are not going to go onto a reduced risk product or even maybe even a nicotine replacement therapy. Finally, we looked at how do e-cigarettes rank in terms of being more harmful or less harmful than smoking. And you'll see that this varies. On the one hand, in India and Brazil, you see in the darker brown color, the majority of people, more people believe e-cigarettes are more dangerous than cigarettes. Yeah, not surprisingly, those are in countries where the government has been a very outspoken voice against e-cigarettes. If they are outspoken against e-cigarettes, what are you left as a smoker believing? Well, just continue with cigarettes, despite a 95, 99% difference in your risk. And finally, looking at some of the questions and approaches used to quit. Many smokers have tried to quit without assistance. Cold turkey. Remember that cold turkey, while the commonest way people quit, is also the least effective. About 4, 5, 6% of people who try cold turkey will have succeeded at the end of the year. suggesting, as we'll get to, we certainly need better ways to deal with such a big public health problem. And I'm going to jump to what those problems are, what we're going to do. As a foundation, we're not happy to just release results to you and walk away. Our goal is to say, so what are we going to do? Which means we will do it. And we'll use Joe's grit, ideas, and inspiration to make it happen. The first thing that we will do is increase awareness of and the empathy of the unique experiences of struggles of smokers and see what they really need. You'll start seeing that in Aaron's videos in the next few minutes. And that's just the start of a rollout around the world and a deeper effort to understand and empathize and work with people who do want life, but they also want happiness. And how do we actually achieve those two together is something which takes us to the third category, which is research on understanding the relative risks of cigarettes versus reduced risk products. All of you, particularly those of you with children, will be raising questions about, aren't these e-cigarettes bad for my kids? And if they're bad for my kids, what about me as a smoker? We need to give better data on the assurances that reduced risk products substantially lower the risk of death and disease in the smoker, and that we can find ways to ensure that kids should not vape, neither should they smoke. A key, of course, is the role of the health professionals. And I mentioned earlier that the smokers are not going in sufficient numbers to actually be in front of a health professional. Health professionals generally are not well trained in addressing modern approaches to smoking cessation and reduced harm, reduced products. Perhaps the UK is the furthest along. We hope to focus on it. And finally, I mentioned that the pipeline, the availability of cessation products that truly work is incredibly weak. We have colleagues here who've worked on a wide range of new innovations in the pharmaceutical area. If you look at the reviews for the last 20 years, there's virtually been no new drug or pharmaceutical approach to address smoking cessation introduced to the market. Secondly, on the reduced risk side, all of the innovations we're seeing, particularly e-cigarettes, heat-not-burn, and to some extent snus, have been developed for and by people in developed countries. We need to accelerate the availability of better cessation and better reduced products that work for and with smokers in the vast majority of the countries where the smoking rates remain extremely high, remembering that 80% of them are in the developing world. Thank you very much. It's now my real pleasure to invite four colleagues to join me, and we should have Solly Ratamami on the video, if it's working well. Solly, can you see us and hear us? Let me ask Greg Conley to join us first here, Nilesh Jain, and Marua Glover. And let me first just briefly introduce Greg. Greg Conley is the president of the American Vaping Association, works with a wide variety of groups, both in the US, but also internationally, and had just had a wonderful trip to Cape Town, I'm pleased to say, where he met a whole lot of other people. Nilesh Jain is based in India. He spent many years between Silicon Valley and India as a true serial entrepreneur, addressing a wide variety of healthcare solutions, of which smoking and smoking cessation and reduced risk represents his latest important challenge and opportunity. And finally, Marua Glover comes all the way from New Zealand, where she has spent many years focusing on the fact that while you saw New Zealand rates generally were lower than so much in the world, she'll tell you that hides an enormous gap between the indigenous Maori population smoking rates, and is really focused on the fact that indigenous people in every setting around the world have smoking rates 2 to 3 to 4 to 5 times those of the general population, and are rarely actually taken account in terms of policy making. So do we have Solly on the line?
He's having connection issues.
Okay, well, let me start with my colleagues here. And for all of you first, I'd love to get your sense of how do you react to these results given the work that you're doing, and what is your interpretation of the results, starting with Greg?
Well, test, am I on? Good. First off, Derek, I just want to thank you not only for the invite to be here today and thank everyone for coming, but also just thank you for heading up this foundation, because I've been doing work on tobacco harm reduction for about 7.5 years, 3 years as a volunteer while in graduate school, and it has long felt like a very small group, a group that at one point you could fit inside the meeting room of a Ramada, against a world that seemingly is against any forward progress on this issue. So to have this meeting, to have this foundation, something that I would never thought we would see. So for the US results, you saw that around 45% of smokers either believed that vaping was just as bad or worse than smoking. And that means that if you ask the non-smokers, that number may be above 50%, which represents the loved ones, the family members that have smokers in their lives, that they are going to say to them, don't try to quit with vaping because it's just as bad for you. And years ago, when this technology first came to market, the smokers and non-smokers who were aware of what vaping and what electronic cigarettes were, you had probably 80% thinking, yeah, these things are obviously less harmful. And so unfortunately, there has been a concerted campaign to generate headlines in the press, to send information directly to smokers, to tell them, don't use this product to try to reduce your risk, because there is no reduction in risk. And we know from the science, we know from what the UK, from what New Zealand has done, that that's simply not true. So I really think that there is an opportunity here that for the foundation to work on research, really getting into why smokers believe this and how do we correct these misperceptions. So again, thank you all for being here.
Thank you, Derek, for the opportunity of allowing me to speak here. I think the results are eye-opening to an extent where the focus needs to be shifted onto people, right? Consumers of tobacco. I think for the longest time, we've been talking about products and talking about different issues. But the real issue in India is about saving lives. We're talking about 250 million people that are dependent on tobacco use. You know, my work in India after I moved back from the Valley was primarily focused on healthcare. And as more and more work we were doing in healthcare, we realized that a lot of these causes in the chronic ailment were due to tobacco, right? And the results are not surprising, and surprising to the fact that 40% of people in India think that alternate products or vaping products are more dangerous, or nicotine is more dangerous than tobacco. And I think our mission is to change that and really change that at the grassroots level. Care about the people, care about the consumer products that are coming in, right? And I have a philosophy, and I call it I-REACH, right? Which I stands for innovation. And I think India is a different market. What works in the West may not work, especially in the low and middle income class category countries, right? To be able to bring out a product that's going to cost you less than $10 for a month's supply of making sure you're getting the right nicotine is going to be very critical. So I think innovation in products and technology around the RP products is going to be very important for countries like India. I think the reach, which means going out and doing advocacy around nicotine and the harm reduction, is very important, because there are a lot of misconceptions in India about what nicotine is versus what tobacco is and what it does to you, including the health impact of nicotine versus tobacco. So I think it's very critical to go address the diversity in India. You're talking about multiple languages, multiple states, multiple thought processes, and also divide that between the urban and rural part of India, right? So it's extremely critical. The third piece is around clinical aspects of cigarettes, right? And then finally about the health issues. So I think if you look at these test results and getting a focus on the outreach is going to be critically important.
Just one figure I always like to think about, and I think I'm right, that about 10% of tobacco products sold on the Indian market are traditional cigarettes. So 90% are not. So when you're thinking of the problem of smoked, whether they're biddies, which are rolled up and smoked, or a wide variety of other products, the diversity on the Indian market is massive. We don't really have a good understanding of the characterization of their relative risk, what exists on the market today. And as you said, we have a public information understanding, which really requires a lot of help, a lot of work. Again, issues that we really want to engage with. Marua.
Thank you. And thank you very much for having me and inviting me here. And you pointed out about the hidden disparities. So New Zealand was an exemplar that was used in the formation of the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control. And we have continued to be a leader along with Australia. And congratulations, you've just reduced your smoking prevalence here in the US to 15%. So that's just... But these national average statistics of 15% and below do hide huge disparities by social rank, socioeconomic status, and ethnicity. And you can see from the international results here the difference by ethnicity, by culture. And this is the case in New Zealand. So my biggest passion is pregnant mums and Indigenous pregnant women in New Zealand. Almost 50% smoke while pregnant. 25% of our large minority Pacific Island population they smoke, and there's been no change for 10 years despite crushing taxes. Our tobacco is the highest in the world relative to income. And the threat of social exclusion is what we use to change people's behaviour. So there's really big things. I think what New Zealand can bring to this, and I would definitely say please don't copy us, at least look at the unintended negative effects of what we've been doing in tobacco control. The alcohol you saw there, New Zealand was quite high on that in terms of it being one of the 3 triggers for smoking. This is because we have strangled where you can smoke down to very, very few places. We've actually strengthened the association with alcohol drinking. So we do make mistakes, and we sometimes worsen other social and public health issues. Thank you.
Thanks, Bro. I think just a few other context issues around the social class and other differences that are hidden by national statistics. Even in the UK, social class differences in smoking are about 3 to 4-fold. So among the poorest social class, you'll have a smoking rate 4 times that of social class 1. And that has not moved for 20 years. Secondly, there are large groups of people with chronic diseases, particularly people with schizophrenia, depression, tuberculosis, where the smoking rates are in excess of 70%. In this country, the proportion of people with schizophrenia who smoke is somewhere around 70–75%. It's not dramatically different with major depression. And as I said, tuberculosis, wherever you look in the world, 70–75% plus of patients smoke, suggesting there's a huge need to actually think a little bit more carefully about the context in which you actually place it. The consequence, particularly for the social class ones, the concentration of smoking among the poorest parts of the society leads to some not unexpected findings which our survey hints at, and that is that a significant proportion of people will forego household expenditures, particularly food, in favor of continuing to smoke. And we saw that from the data in Brazil, where the figure was 80–85% of people saying they would forego food in favor of smoking. Let me turn to one last question to each of you to give a quick sense to the audience of what do you believe that the foundation could do in the sharpest possible way to have an impact according to our vision?
I think a great message is focusing on the smoker. And that should be the bulk of the research that the foundation does. But you need to also have some focus on the non-smoker adult, because it is the loved ones, the family members, the friends of adult smokers that are the ones saying to them, you should try to quit. But if you achieve a point where the vast majority of smokers understand that vaping is far less hazardous than smoking or heat not burn or snooze products, but their loved ones and their friends think it's just as bad as smoking, they will not have the social support that prods someone, that pushes them to actually stay on their quit journey. So the non-smoker is also as important, or maybe even more important than the smoker.
I think that's, we've been debating about this question of how the foundation can really support of what's happening in India. I think advocacy is going to be a huge area that we need to focus on, given the diversity, both in terms of economic status as well as the diversity in the range of people and languages that we speak. I think that's going to be critical. The second is going to be innovation around these products, because one size doesn't fit all. We've seen this just from our research study. So I think it's going to be very critical in focusing on what fits in which segments and how do we address that.
I think you've said a lot this morning about a more holistic focus is needed. And what we've done is focus so heavily on the physiological side of smoking and we've ignored the effects on the family, the social. You mentioned about people foregoing food. So New Zealand looks great on the smoking, but we have among the highest rates of obesity in the world as well. And the lower socioeconomic groups are certainly, as I said, with our crushing taxes, that is taking money out of their pockets and contributing to this other problem. So I think you've signalled that you're very interested in that, and I would support you to do that.
Great. Well, can you please give a round of applause to our three colleagues? And I don't know, Chris is going to join me again now. And while he's being wired up with technology, I would just place another plug for technology. But I think what has changed over the last 20 years is our understanding of nicotine, our ability to separate nicotine, which, as I said, addicts, from everything else that kills, and do it in a wider variety of products than we ever had possible. The problem is that all of the research, maybe 85, 90% of the research, is really done in two major countries, the US and the UK, which are home to 5% of the world's smokers. And I think, as Nilesh and many others will stress, we need to build up these centers of excellence and capability in the countries where you've got the problem, because we'll find different solutions that'll help all of us worldwide. Chris.
Derek, now's the time when we're going to take questions from the media who have tuned into the webcast. They're being beamed to me here. Here's how you do it. Just as a reminder, if you're watching the webcast, there are 3 buttons. The one button you want to hit is labeled Q&A, question and answer, Q&A. Hit that, send your question in here. So Derek, one of the questions here is, how do you think that the results of your global survey will influence the various countries in their own smoking cessation policies? Or is that even your goal?
Well, I think I've seen in other areas of public policy, whether it was HIV/AIDS, remember at the start of the HIV/AIDS epidemic, there was a strong anti-treatment push. It was rejected by governments as being too expensive. It wasn't going to achieve much goal. What changed it was when people with HIV/AIDS actually took up the cudgels and said, we actually need better, more effective treatment to solve our problems today. We don't want to just focus on prevention tomorrow. And I think that's why Greg's comments become so important. We need to have a stronger voice of people who are smoking, vaping, and trying to actually either quit or reduce their risk at the table to drive some of the decisions. I think that this data in their hands will actually be a very strong push for better science in their country, better advocacy in country, and hopefully through the political processes, ultimately, smarter regulations that will be supported.
So with this move into innovations like e-cigarettes or heat, not burn devices, or even nicotine replacement therapy, as it's called, the gum or the patches, why do we see this potential fear or reluctance or resistance? Do they think it's just yet another way to get consumers hooked as opposed to harm reduction?
I think there are many reasons. First, I do think that the historical and to this day, current practices of the tobacco industry in thwarting sensible public policy continues and is a really big overhang in the minds of many people. They are convinced that anybody making a product that claims to be reduced risk isn't. The last big call was when we had low-tar cigarettes introduced many years ago. Many in public health first thought, well, maybe this makes sense, and supported it. It turned out that it didn't make sense. And both low-tar and low nicotine simply actually led to a continuation, often with worse types of cancers than before. I think that's part of it. The second part is that, for reasons I don't fully understand, the notion of harm reduction in tobacco control hasn't taken hold in the way we've seen it in HIV/AIDS or in drug areas. Safer sex, the use of condoms, needle exchanges, seatbelts, all great examples of harm reduction. It doesn't bring your risk to zero, but certainly removes it by 85, 90, 95%, actually less than what an e-cigarette would do. I think that the reason is because there's a very strong black-white view of the world. You either smoke or you don't smoke. You either quit or you don't quit, and there's no alternative that people believe in between. I think that's an educational factor. So I think it's going to be a combination. I think what's happened is that the technology advances in separating the nicotine from the bad stuff has actually gone much faster among the general population of smokers than among policymakers and health professionals. They need to catch up now with the reality of the data and the stronger and emerging science, as we've seen by the exemplary statements of Public Health England and increasingly by the FDA here.
Well, speaking of the FDA, just last week, the Food and Drug Administration here in the United States announced that it was going to begin to forcibly reduce the nicotine levels in tobacco products, right? So at one level, wow, since nicotine is what gets us addicted, that sounds really like, why not? But at another level, is there a potential backfire effect to that?
Yes, I think there is. But I think before I just answer that, I think let's remember that Scott Gottlieb is the relatively new head of the FDA, very soon into his term, last year, put out a very important statement. He was the first time that a senior US official has made the statement about nicotine not being the cause of the death and disease, but it being tar and combustible cigarettes. And he went on then to say that for that reason, the FDA policy will be to try and move people off combustible cigarettes onto cleaner forms of nicotine and make them more attractive and available on the market. That includes medicated solutions and includes the category of reduced risk products. If you listen to that statement alone, of course, as a smoker, you're left thinking, okay, if I want to reduce my risk, there's a range of options. Let me go and take them because he's saying that's not bad. Unfortunately, last week's statement now saying we've got to lower nicotine is probably going to confuse a smoker, because what would you do faced with, on the one hand, being told, good thing, the problem is the tar, and then the next week being told, we've got to lower nicotine. Well, if you're going to lower something, it must be pretty bad. And remember the data we showed you. People are unable to separate the addiction or the dependence effect of nicotine from the harm effect, which is quite a complicated issue, not just for the general public, but even for health professionals to get their mind around. So I would say the first concern I would have is that putting the two statements alongside each other is going to increase the degree of confusion, let alone starting to get into the debate about whether there will be untoward effects and whether it will really play out. Remember that the reduced risk side is based now on 60 years of snus, maybe 10 years of e-cigarettes, 30 years of nicotine replacement therapy. The low nicotine experiment is based on one maybe study out there, and that's it.
So as a recovering journalist myself, I have to say that one of the things that struck me in all this is that the danger of a kind of absolutist thinking. In other words, it feels kind of creepy to say, don't quit. I mean, just quit. That's it. Just quit is the only option. And when you begin to say to people, well, use these crutches, it almost feels like a methadone clinic for heroin, right? You say, use these, e-cigarettes, for example, or use nicotine patches. It just still feels a little creepy probably to a lot of people to recommend that. And yet I went and I looked up the success rate for people who use nicotine replacement therapy, gum or patches. Do you guys have any idea what the success rate is of quitting smoking, sustained? It's less than 5%. It ranges between 1-3% usually. So even going to the nicotine side. So my question, Derek, is if you take this absolutist view that it's quit or nothing, what do you do with 900 million or 950 million people who actually cannot quit or will not quit?
I think the first thing is we should ask, why did the patch and the gum only give us such a low success rate? And I don't think it was a failure of the basic physiological principle that nicotine is what people seek. I think it was the way it was delivered that we increasingly know that it doesn't mimic the way we take nicotine into our blood, where people smoke and they get a nicotine fix on the brain, and that reduces their craving, and then they go for a period of time without it. That's what the e-cigarette, the heat-not-burn, the snus, and are actually mimicking far better, and that's why you're starting to see both higher uptakes of those products and potentially higher cessation on those products as well. So there was that real physiological reality that it's only in the last few years that we've been talking about this very arcane issue of nicotine levels in the brain and the wonderful graphics going on. In fact, the work was done in the 1970s by Mike Russell in the UK when he was publishing it, but nobody bothered to read it. I think the problem that we face is that many people also feel that it's a bit of a sign of internal weakness. We might say that they would rather grow the version of grit and tough it out and go cold turkey. And that's the right way to do it, actually cease using it. And unfortunately, not realizing that there are deep physiological independence factors holding them.
And is there a bit of a fear when you have something like a flavored e-cigarette, for example, that parents will look at that and go, oh my God, my kid, who may not have adopted, burning smoking, combustible smoking, may start using an e-cigarette because the allure of something that tastes like fruit punch or something.
Yeah, again, there, I think the emerging science is interesting. Intuitively, one would believe that a sort of a gummy bear flavored e-cigarette is clearly designed for a child. In fact, much of the evidence suggests children prefer gummy bears than gummy bear flavored e-cigarettes. And it's the adult smoker wanting to get the taste of tobacco away that is seeking the flavor to give a fresh, new flavor. And that the flavor is an extremely useful way of getting people to switch. One of the greatest, very elegant studies done by colleagues at Yale, for example, looked at menthol and basically showed that menthol e-cigarettes were a way of getting adults off cigarettes faster than a non-menthol cigarette. The policy implication then is ban menthol cigarettes, combustible cigarettes, but permit menthol in the e-cigarette, and you will accelerate the switching, is what we want.
So again, we're going back to the journalist questions. Hit your Q&A button as you're watching us here. Here's one about Lebanon, and we saw the very high, Lebanon. We saw the very high figures there about smoking. And the question is, with countries like Lebanon, where there's such a strong history and culture of tobacco already in place, how can you realistically create a culture that embraces alternatives to traditional combustible tobacco?
Well, I think that applies. Every country loves to think that it's unique. I think it should, because it is unique. But I think if we look at the experience in Japan, who would have thought that in Japan, where people say the culture of Japan, of course, means that they love their cigarettes. And I can remember being at WHO, going to the Ministry of Health, and in the middle of the meeting, the people would rush out to the vending machine in the passage and come back with a pack of cigarettes and smoke it through the meeting while we were discussing how to address tobacco control in Japan. And what happened? We're now seeing the fastest decline of almost any consumer product is underway in Japan. 18 to 20% drop in combustible cigarette use has occurred in Japan over the last 18 months. And it's now a competition between the three major cigarette manufacturers to get reduced risk products onto the market as fast as possible and compete to end combustible use in Japan. You'd have thought, well, by cultural reasons, this is impossible. Well, it's happening. And it's probably happening because people are playing to the local culture and understanding what the Japanese smoker is seeking is something cleaner, fresher, not necessarily focusing explicitly on lowering their lung cancer risk, but allows them to continue the conviviality and the interaction with their friends and colleagues in different ways. And I think the same could happen in Lebanon if Lebanon was given the chance to introduce reduced risk products onto its market. I have no doubt the same would happen.
Derek, earlier you mentioned about the correlation between doctors who smoke and a higher per capita base amongst their patients who also smoke, kind of mirroring them. There's a question here. What's your message to clinicians about their role in smoking cessation? What needs to happen to improve their effectiveness at the clinical practice level?
Well, I think 2 points. First, I'd I like to remind people that in the history of looking at smoking among doctors, the first studies in tobacco, the biggest ones, was by Sir Richard Dawes, who died a few years ago. And he tracked doctors who smoked in the UK for 50 years. And he showed that over the 50 years, of course, the smoking rates were dramatically higher in smokers than in non-smokers. The first people to read those results were obviously the doctors. They were reading the British Medical Journal and the Lancet, and they were the first to quit. The same is true in every country in the world. There is no place in the world where the smoking rates in the general population come down before they first come down in doctors. And that creates an enormous responsibility on doctors to be aware that it's not just the advice they're providing, it's the subtle signals that they may be giving of support for smoking, of not being active in the advocacy groups, of talking about some of the new options. So my advice to doctors is, first thing is, faced with a patient who smokes, you need to make sure you're giving them the best possible advice, which could be for some quitting, for some using a reduced risk product, as the British government recommends, and be very clear about having a discussion around that will lower your risks. But secondly, as citizens, as informed citizens from the profession, we'd hope you'd stand up and become advocates and active in the field of health, recognizing that smoking is still, in most countries, single most preventable risk factor that will affect many chronic diseases, cancers, heart disease, chronic lung disease, and tuberculosis.
Another question from the viewers here. Can you please comment on education of young children about the health impacts of smoking and how the Foundation for a Smoke-Free World may be looking at efforts to improve this? This sounds like the upstream portion before people actually trial cigarettes.
Chris, I think you and I know that the sad news is that school education and health education programs alone tend to have very little effect. They're one of those sets of interventions where we believe, we hope, we think, just got to tell the kids what they're going to do, and they're going to do it. Well, we have an obesity epidemic, we have an opioid epidemic, we have legalization of marijuana, which is probably going to send marijuana through the roof. We have lack of physical activity in our schools, and we have smoking and vaping. The education programs are not working. Clearly, we need to be thinking about it in different ways. You certainly need to provide the base information to kids in a more lively and active way, but you also need to make sure that the products that are on the market are the least lethal and the most likely to reduce their long-term risk, which in the case of cigarettes or vaping means either making them virtually unacceptable or make kids barriers to actually getting them extremely tough, but then make barriers to things you want kids more accessible. Better sports and physical facilities, better access to healthy food, and so on. So this is not an easy issue, and the foundation would be one of a huge array of players who would be engaged in this, and yes, we would be engaged with others. We do not see it going to be a central focus that we're going to go out to educate kids, both because we don't think it's going to make a difference, but secondly because we think there are such a wide range of players out there that are more active in this field. In this country, the Campaign for Tobacco-Free Kids' entire sole focus is in trying to get kids not to start smoking.
And we know in economies that are supported by something that is very prized, you'll have built-in adversaries if they don't get on board. And we see the model of George Washington, who did a migration from tobacco to wheat and 6 other crops. What is going to be the foundation's role in trying to find an alternative living for tobacco farmers so they don't become built-in adversaries?
That's a very important question. And I think the spirit of empathizing with the smoker extends to empathizing with the tobacco farmer. It came home to me 25 years ago when, with the Minister of Health of Zimbabwe, I hosted the first All-Africa meeting on tobacco control, which was probably the first time farmers were actually invited to the meeting. And the lead speech was by the then Minister of Agriculture of Malawi, a man called Henry Ntaba. And his opening line, I've never forgotten. He basically said, I'm a farmer first, a tobacco farmer second. And what he was saying was, give me an alternative with a better return for the families, for the farmers, and I'm not wed to this crop. The reality has been until now, there hasn't been a bigger push on thinking through what is that alternative, while demand remains so high worldwide. We know from the experience in poppy growing in Afghanistan that you try and lower demand, you try and switch people when the demand on the streets of Europe and America remains high. It seems like you know this very well.
You literally just said that.
Basically. Well, we will fail. But now two things are happening. First, demand is coming down in real terms, and demand will particularly affect certain African countries. Second of all, the plight of the tobacco farmer is not a great plight, that some of the poorest countries in the world are the most dependent on tobacco, suggesting that the route out of poverty is not to become a tobacco-dependent country, as the route out of you getting better health is to become a tobacco-dependent person. And so we're taking a broad-brush approach, and we would hope in the video you'll get a sense of some of the real-life experiences and struggles of farmers. And I would hope next time we come to you, we will actually have some pretty rigorous plans on how we're going to address this, starting in very specific, discrete countries with some programs in place.
And the rollout, as a reminder, again, for media there, the rollout for this, you will also see country by country symposia to help delve into some of these findings. Is that right?
Yeah, so in each of the countries, we're in the US now, but we're doing global, but we will be going to each country and having a discussion with people from the country around what matters to them, going into depth in the results, and we would urge you look at the results in depth because we just really scratched the surface on this, really to start a dialogue in the countries. And I think as we get into the videos, the power of actually having a discussion is so important. When I was in WHO, this was almost 15, 20 years ago, we had huge interest in global tobacco issues being a major cause of death and disease in the world. In fact, since then, with the exception of the last few months, it's actually declined. And if you ask people what are the major causes of death and disease and preventable causes of death in the world, they will usually say AIDS, malaria, tuberculosis, maybe vaccine, preventable diseases. Well, if you add all of those up, they dwarf the single fact that there are 7 million people dying of tobacco every year, and that number is going to rise to 10 million within the next decade.
And there's a question that repeats a little bit of what you've already been into, but I'll honor it nonetheless here. It says, is there a danger of steering people away from quitting by establishing the idea of alternatives? This is to your point of the sort of tough approach of it's quit or nothing. I guess, you know, my pushback to that would be, what do you do about 950 million people? We know that these successful smoking cessation rates are quite low. No matter what tool you use, they're very, very low. Do you just write them off? Do you say, it's either quit or die? Or what do you do?
Well, we intend to redouble our efforts to make sure that we bring more effective quitting and cessation products to the market and stimulate innovators, entrepreneurs to do that, while at exactly the same time, we're going to both assess and stimulate greater innovation on the reduced risk side, recognizing that for some people, quitting is not something they desire, and for others, it is. And again, go back to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Most people would agree, the pursuit of life is an intense goal of all smokers, but they want to do it in a spirit of liberty. And they certainly want to do it in pursuing happiness. And happiness for them is translated into an intrinsic sense of reward or pleasure. And the more we look at this, we see this is actually a significant proportion of smokers will actually prefer to go onto a reduced risk product that is truly verified, lowering your risk, but gives them the pleasure that they seek and they want. And I don't know that as a society, we have a right to actually stop them getting that.
Derek, why did you get into this? You've been at this for 30 years. This is not a fad for you. Why did you get into this whole line of advocacy, of research, of expertise to begin with?
I wish I knew, actually, but you know, when I reflect on it, it was either my mother's smoking, and bless her, she's 87, she's no longer smoking. But I think more seriously, I was on campus in South Africa during the apartheid years, and many of us in public health felt that we needed to go into epidemiology and public health to go after the big numbers and where the big numbers are going to have to be addressed. And it struck me that there was very little focus on smoking and tobacco in South Africa at that time. And the projections using what was happening worldwide were very clear, that as the country urbanized, as people moved to the cities, as we started seeing tobacco rates rise, and as we saw the continuing rapid decline of infectious diseases, the chronic disease category in tobacco would be where the action is. And I've been proven right. That's why I went into it.
And finally with this, you know, in those 30 years, you've seen a lot of innovation, you've seen a lot of smart techniques, you've seen things you thought would work fail, maybe things serendipitously work that nobody would try. As you reflect back now, where you are right now in your experience and your wisdom, what do you see that is most wrong-headed in either assumptions about what will work or in policy?
I think Greg highlighted this when he said we've got to engage the smoker. And I frankly, have to plead mea culpa, probably with all my WHO colleagues, because we really systematically cleansed the tobacco control movement and argument of smokers. I was probably one of the last senior officials in the tobacco control team at WHO 15 years ago to even employ a smoker. And people were surprised. She was an outstanding person. She was incredible support, so why would you not want to? So I think the demonization and the stigmatization and the exclusion of the smoker from the debate about their own livelihood and their own future represents maybe the biggest aha that I believe we need to address if we're really now going to get the billion figure down.
Well, we're all behind you. It's an amazing, it's a huge mission, and in many ways, health, we know that healthcare costs are bankrupting economies all around the world. So we want to support you in this and wish you the very best and hope that you can make a giant impact.